this is going to sound unbelievable, but I wouldn't surprise me if they went out and got a JUCO wide receiver if they felt like it was the right guy versus a transfer. A JUCO wide receiver probably is, this is just being blunt, it's probably not going to cost you as much money, NIL money. If they found the right JUCO receiver, it wouldn't surprise me if they went and got somebody like that, if that guy wanted to go to Nebraska. But they're going to go in the portal for receiver. They have to. After the season's over, they have to go to the portal for receiver.
Oh, yeah. Billy Kemp's gone. Marcus Washington's gone.
Fleeks is gone. The reports I've heard on Betts are really positive, and that's great. But, he will be a senior. So will Isaiah Garcia-Castaneda next year. So they have to. I mean, there's just no guarantee. You cannot rely. By then, they will know how many freshmen were ready to go. But simultaneously, you can't rely on the freshmen you're bringing in, especially a couple of these freshmen. You might be able to put Carter Nelson out there as a wideout, but some of the other guys, it's just going to take some time. I think McMorris is maybe a guy that can play right away. I think Hall needs to gain weight. Quinn Clark, the great thing about him is he catches touchdowns. You have to when you're that tall, but he's probably a year or two away. So they'll go to the portal for wide receiver, I'm sure. They should be in pretty good shape at quarterback, but you never know. Might have to go to the portal for one of those two. And then, you don't want to have to go to the portal for defensive tackle if you don't want to. If you don't have to. You don't want to.
Everybody's looking for those guys.
Yeah, if you don't have to.
How much do you, at this point in the cycle, think about, because I've gotten asked this question a few times already, how many Nebraska is going to end up taking? To me, it's almost a fool's errand to even talk about that at this point, because there's no limit to the class signing anymore.
Right.
Because you have no idea what's going to happen in the portal, and you're going to have to address that at some point. And you just look at what Nebraska did last year when they brought in, 39, 40 players. Ultimately, they oversigned and they winnowed it down. But I feel like that question is sort of outdated for the model that we're in. Do you even go down that road? I mean, they have 21 as we're sitting here on a Thursday afternoon. Where do you even see that number going, generally speaking, or does it matter at this point?
That's a really good question. So I think if I feel like I understand what Nebraska's trying to do in recruiting, they know that this year, this season, and next, they're fairly well set up in terms of depth at a number of positions. The offensive line's going to be in good shape for experienced depth this season and next. I think that's also true at linebacker. Maybe those guys move on after this year, but I would be surprised. I think they'll probably stick around for the extra year. And then their secondary is probably this year, but they might be able to pull through to next year, provided they can get a cornerback or two out of the portal. But I think the understanding is, hey, when this thing hits 2025 and the schedule is still tough, who is our football team? Who's going to be on it and who's going to be doing what? And I think what's being built right now, Evan, both with the most recent class and with this class, is here's going to be our backbone in 2 years. So these are guys that are going to be redshirt sophomores and redshirt freshmen, or true sophomores and true juniors. And so I think they had to add to the class in a significant enough way that by the time this team is in 2025, and you can look at the scholarship distribution chart, there's a crap load of sophomores, right? And so by then, those are your seniors, and then you've kind of built it back up. I do think there comes a day where Nebraska doesn't have to take 25 high school kids because they feel good about the depth that they have. And maybe you can supplement that with 20 high schoolers and 5 transfers. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Because, of course, you can always take 35 or whatever. You don't really want to. Ideally, you don't have to. You'd like that number to be between 25 and 30, and you're always going to use the portal. You have to. I mean, it's a law now. It's basically a law that you're going to have some players, you're going to borrow something from the portal because there's just some guy in there where you're like, if we don't go get a guy that can make us better right away for 1 or 2 years, somebody else is going to get that guy, and they're going to get better. And so I think there's always going to be a sense of, unless you're Alabama, you're going to have to, pluck out of the portal. And Bama went and got Jahmyr Gibbs.
They did.
So they'll do it too. So I think that's probably where they're at. Is I think this class is probably going to be 25 again, high school kids, maybe a little larger. Probably around 25. They're at 21 now. I think they need 2 tackles, maybe 2 more defensive players. Caleb Benny at defensive back. And I think that's about it. I would take one more tight end. I would take one more. I'd try to go get the best tight end I could because I think the way that this offense is going to be built, it's going to be built around tight ends. And I think they could use one more that's a tweener between Carter Nelson and whatever Ian Flint's going to become.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe. But they also have Keelan Smith and Quinn Clark, who they kind of see as maybe those guys, too.
Yes.
So maybe whether they get that person will inform their view on the guys that they currently have in the class.
And they're, and they have 20. I mean, the punter is the punter. And that when you add the punter, you're adding a punter for 4 years. That's a 4-year recruit. That's
right.
Not a 2-year deal. That's you're going to be our punter, and we're going to work with you, and you're going to get better. And same thing with Alvano. So, you're only going to do that once every 4 years. So it kind of counts and it kind of doesn't. Like it's a one-guy position, and you don't ever expect that player to get hurt.
Mm-hmm. And you think is it, I guess, put into context how unusual it is that Nebraska has most of the hay in the barn, and we're not even through June yet. Because I feel like, the rhythm for years has been, okay, you've got a core of guys, maybe 8 to 10 by the end of the summer, and then you fill out the rest through official visits, and then in recent years it's been you fill out the rest through the portal or whatnot. Right now, they've got 21 players in the class.
It's uncommon because some of the players that they took commits from were players that didn't have offers, and we haven't seen that before. So I think one of the things, we haven't seen it to this extent. Jake Peters didn't have a Power 5 offer, unless you don't count Army and Navy. Jake Peters didn't have one. Braylon Prude didn't have one. Rex Guthrie didn't have one. Landon Davidson didn't have one. Not really. He got one from Colorado right after he got the one. Callum Barta didn't have one.
Quinn Clark didn't have one.
Quinn Clark didn't have one. So that's 6. That's like a third of the class. 30% of the class didn't have a Power 5 offer. So no, you don't. Donovan Jones, 7. 33% of the class didn't have one. So what happens is, now again, just so we're clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with what they did. I think, but this is because of my own personal belief system, that the range of the 251st player, the 158th player to the 600th player, the range is quite small. And it doesn't mean that the 158th player won't be a great player. But what I'm saying is that the 600th player might be better than the 158th player, because when you're looking in that range, nobody really knows.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. You don't have enough evaluation tools. It's hard to know. There's going to be a 3-star who ends up being a superstar. And you're going to be like, nobody knew. And I'm like, they didn't know on the 158th guy either, but you got to have a list. So they made one. And this kid might be a little bit better than this guy. I mean, we've seen this before. I think if you go back and look at the highest rated running backs that Nebraska signed, a lot of them just haven't been very good. They get here, they're 4 stars, and they get here, and you're like, I don't really know what all the hubbub was about. Divina Zigbo is better than this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy. Like, he was better because I just don't think you really know a lot of the time. If you get a 5-star, yeah, he's probably pretty good, but you don't know for sure. And so that's what I mean, is that, like, when you watch Rick Guthrie, and if his testing numbers are what Nebraska tested him at, you're like, why doesn't this guy have offers? And then you realize it doesn't really matter. Like, if he's good, he's good. He doesn't play, unlike Carter Nelson. Rex Guthrie does not play in a tiny town. He plays in Littleton, Colorado, and he plays in the highest level of the sport. So does Landon Davidson. And I don't know why that kid didn't have a Colorado offer until Nebraska offered him. I have no clue.
Don't you think it's going to be really fun?
So we'll see.
To see how some of these evaluation guys turn out. I mean, the 7 that you mentioned in this class, but like even the end of the last class with DeAndre Barnes and
Jeremiah Charles.
Ismail Smith-Flores.
He was
to a
going to Iowa.
Eric Fields.
Yeah.
Like,
No
it's going to
question.
be really, like, if those guys hit, then I think you're going to see even more in the future when Nebraska offers a kid. A bunch of people are going to offer a kid because they trust that evaluation. Just the hit rate and what that is in the next, like, 3 to 4 years with some of these guys is really fascinating.
I agree with you. Now, there's a Moneyball quality to this, too, though. And I think maybe that's something that Matt Rhule is going to exploit. We will see. But the reality is there were better football players in the state of Nebraska for years. For years there were. They didn't go here. Nebraska didn't offer them. They went to South Dakota State and North Dakota State and won national championships. Kyle Emanuel was good enough to play at Nebraska. So was Easton Stick. So were a number of players that went there from the state of Nebraska. And North Dakota State would have gone down and beat a number of the teams in FBS with relative ease. We used to look at an offer from North Dakota State as a notch below an offer from Ohio. But if those two teams had played 10 times, I'll take the Bison. There's 7 of them. So what had happened was these teams got fat and rich off of Midwestern kids from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa. Took all these guys. And so I think that's part of what was realized. In the state of Colorado, offensive linemen are recruited really well. They have a lot of big kids there. Mm-hmm. Skill players are not. So
Right.
JoJo Doman, who's a hell of a good player, was down in basically Nebraska and Kansas State. And it's because they don't recruit. A lot of schools will not send their coaches to recruit there, skill kids there. So, or, if Colorado didn't offer them, like Colorado knows what it's doing. So, granted, they beat Nebraska twice. But, there's these things that are going on. And so I think you go out, Rex Guthrie's there. Good player. Other people haven't recruited him. You have no idea who's gone through there to even talk to him. And he goes, he does what he does, and it's a big deal. Callan Barta, how many people go to Topeka? So it's all these things. Mm-hmm. In a lot of cases, there's a Moneyball way of winning. Iowa's figured it out. Iowa understands. Iowa's not perfect. I know. I'm not trying to give them undue credit. But my goodness, their one-loss record of the last 5 or 6 years, Nebraska would kill to have. And the reason Iowa's done that is because they go to Detroit and they go to Chicago and they get 3-star kids that are just as good as the 4-star kids, and then they get kids from their own state, and they don't worry about whether or not other teams are coming up, and now teams are starting to come up, but they go to the other kids of their own state. They go get a bunch of Butkus Award winners. Jack Campbell, 6'5" and 235 pounds, it can run like a gazelle. Who cares what his star rating is,
Right.
And that's part of the issue. I'll never forget Antoine Winfield's kid was like a low 3-star in Minneapolis. Ridiculous. Antoine Winfield was a great player. Mm-hmm. Maybe the best tackler at corner there was when he was playing. And his kid was great. His kid didn't have any offers except for Minnesota. And that's just because the college teams didn't know what they were doing. And that stuff happens. It's just part of the deal. You have to always keep in mind that most college staffs are populated with coaches that want to recruit in certain areas because they have to build a recruiting resume so that when they go on to their next job, they can go to UCLA or whatever and say, I too have recruited in Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles. Here are my connections. Here is my Rolodex.
Right.
And that Rolodex doesn't look as impressive when you're saying, I've recruited in Omaha and Lincoln and here and here and here.
Topeka, yep.
Which is why Ed Foley does the recruiting for those areas. Why? Why does he do those recruiting for those areas? Why is Tony White going around and doing the recruiting in those areas? Because those guys' resumes are not built on their recruiting. Tony White's resume at this point to become a head coach is built on how good of a defense he coordinates at Nebraska.
That's right.
Ed Foley works for Matt Rhule. Period. End of story. He doesn't have to build a recruiting resume because his job is to do what Rhule wants him to do, A, and B, to run special teams. So you pay close attention to where the coordinators recruit because oftentimes those are the places where the position coaches don't want to go. Because they're like, I'm still having to build my resume off of recruiting. So you notice Tony White and Ed Foley are driving around Nebraska and Iowa. And in my opinion, you should send a position coach to Omaha and make him realize how good the talent is up there, but that's challenging. Doesn't surprise me that E.J. Barthel got his running back from Dallas.
Right.
Who did they get the last year? They got the running back from basically Philadelphia, New Jersey area.
Philadelphia. Yep.
Where Quentin Ives was as close to Philadelphia as where Keywan Lacey is now. It's close to Dallas, so it's basically the same.
Yeah.
But that's what you do. Like, you send your position coaches to recruiting hubs, and then your coordinators. You know, who's recruiting Colorado? Marcus Satterfield.
Right.
Has Marcus Satterfield spent 5 days in the state of Colorado before he came to Nebraska? I doubt it.
Probably not.
Probably not. No. Maybe not. But now he's recruiting Colorado. He's the one that gets Landon Davidson to show up. He's the guy that's going out there. You send your recruiting coordinators around the Midwest. Bill Bush last year. You know, you send your recruiting coordinators around the Midwest because they don't have a resume to build as it relates to a recruiter. But I guarantee you, when Bill Bush was recruiting back in the day, when he was recruiting for Nebraska back when you were in college, where was he recruiting?
Bill Bush?
Yeah.
California.
Arizona and California.
Yeah. Right.
That's right. So, anyway.
No, that's a great point, because we talk a lot about the value of like a family staff. Like, most of these guys on the staff owe something to Rhule, or they've worked with Matt Rhule, or they've been players for Matt Rhule. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, there's a uniformity of message that comes out, but like the recruiting piece is really interesting, because like there's a sense that like we don't really care who gets the glory. Like,
that's true.
We want to work with each other. I'm not here as sort of a free agent coach to better my resume as a stepping stone to something greater. So maybe that's part of the momentum we're seeing with this effort as well.
Yeah, I think that's partially true. Obviously, Nebraska got 2 receivers out of Omaha. For example, just as an example of the original point I was making, will we see Nebraska continue to recruit this hard in California now that those 2 guys came out and made a visit? 3 guys, all from Matter Day, came out and made a visit, and none of them picked Nebraska. You keep going out there, and you can keep bringing those kids in for visits, but those kids don't usually go to Nebraska. So how many more hours? And we deal with this in our jobs too. Like, how many hours do we want to spend on something that we think is cool and neat and might win us an award, but ultimately people don't read?
Sure. The only thing about that I would say is maybe that continues because of the UCLA USC effect, and you're playing out there. So maybe that sort of changes that conversation a little bit.